Well, thanks for spending a little time with me on this beautiful reading from Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 1 through 11. That's the Old Testament reading for the first Sunday in Lent. I'm going to read just a little bit of that from the NRSV. A wandering Aramean was my ancestor. He went down into Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number, and there he became a great nation, mighty and populous. And when the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor on us, we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. And the Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction and our toil and our oppression. And the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with terrifying display of power, signs and wonders. And he brought us into this place and gave us this land. In a close reading of the Hebrew text, I think there are three groups of things to be observed. The first one is a kind of a clever planting. You notice that the condition in Egypt is described as being an alien. And then at the very end of the reading, in verse 11, we have a mention of the stranger. I'm going to talk about that later. But it's a clever way of preparing us for the finale of that inclusion of strangers. The second thing is that when Hebrew poets, and this is a kind of a poetry, want us to become empathically invested in what is being described, the idea of repetition is being used masterfully here, so that the idea, the thought, the feeling gets lodged in the heart and the mind as well. And we do this in hymnody and other liturgical forms, of course. So here we get several groupings of three, and it's not accidental. So that the condition down in Egypt, you heard it read, is we were lived in oppression. We were put to hard labor. We were treated badly. And then when Yahweh hears, Yahweh describes what Yahweh has heard and seen, and what Yahweh hears and sees is exactly the same thing, but yet different words. I mean, the vocabulary here is enormous. It was miserable poverty. We were oppressed. We were living in abject fear. And then in Yahweh's description of what Yahweh does, Yahweh brought us out. Yahweh brought us in. Yahweh set us up. And then in describing the way in which Yahweh does this with a mighty hand, and that's exactly what it says in Hebrew, a mighty hand, Yad Gadol. We get multiple descriptions of what that looked like. So again and again and again, we're drawn into this. And that means this is not simply to be read as a kind of a historical declaration, but one that taps into the very roots of what it means to be in that kind of condition. That condition can be made particular and universal. The third observation is about verbs, and Hebrew is a language of verbs. And what can happen is that verbs predominate sentences, so that hardly a pronoun or a noun exists if you really want to describe action. And of course, the construction of the Hebrew verb is completely different than any Western language. And here we're seeing some really clever things being done with the kind of a switch between what we call kal and hithil and vav consecutive and that kind of thing. But to cut it right down to the chase, it's the key in verse 7, part A and part B. In part A, Israel begins with a verb, yitzhak, cry, we cry. We cried. The response of Yahweh, the sentence also begins with a verb. And the verb is shema. Yahweh heard. And the second verb, Yahweh ra'ah, saw, heard and saw. Israel cried. God heard and cried. Now, there's something very subtle going on here. In all of Deuteronomy, there is perhaps no more really important word than shema. Why? Because very often, as the description of what is obligated and what has happened to Israel begins with exactly that word. Shema Israel, hear Israel. And in chapter 6, we have the most important prayer in Judaism. And in fact, it's called the Shema. Shema Israel, and ends with God is one. This is clever because it also has a kind of theological logic to it. We listen because God listened to us and set our feet on solid ground. There are other verbs of great importance, but those predominate as being so significant to the core of what has happened to Israel and why Israel is called to this marvelous feast. Let's move to verse 11, because there we have this wonderful, wonderful Hebraic notion of when all is said and done, we are left the wonderful task of just enjoyment. The V'chal HaTov, and you probably recognize the word tov, good, huh? V'chal HaTov. Let's party, let's have fun. It's great. Life is good. We've been redeemed. We've been given a wonderful outcome. Why not be happy? In fact, we're commanded to be happy. And now I come to the first point, which is the last point. And that's the command to engage in this hatov, this good times, absolutely must include the stranger, the gerim. Simple word, ger. I recently read a wonderful German research piece that was written in light of the refugee issue in Germany. A deep exploration of the idea of the stranger in the Hebrew Bible. And there are three terms, and this one is the one that it predominates. And I want to tell you that the word is not just a passing thought here. It's critical. You're going to find it in much of the legislation of Israel. Again and again, the author I was reading points out it's used 92 times in the Hebrew Bible. It's a requirement. These strangers are not necessarily proselytes, and they're not required to follow all of the celebrations and all the requirements. They are required to participate and play by the rules of Israel, but they're also to be included in the benefits of a lawful society and etc. I don't know if this is where you want to focus, but let me tell you, you are on solid ground. Now, I don't know how you're going to read this passage. You can read it as a national epic. There's some problems with that, but if you do, be sure to include the alien, the stranger, the refugee. It can be read as our own story of misery that we've been plunged into, either by our own stupidity or sin or whatever, and then clawed our way out through recovery or whatever, and then we stand in awe-inspiring position of being totally grateful for life and enjoying life. However, it has power. I am so pleased to have this chance to be with you, and I just hope you have the wonderful time with this passage that I have had this past week. Thanks for listening.